After covering Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey in multiple breakdown videos and hearing what other viewers have had to say about the film, it's clear that the director has made choices that have been received both positively and negatively. Having read Homer's epic poem, there are a few differences to make note of, and ones which were made for this adaptation's focus on a cinematic large-scale telling of the Odyssey story for a modern audience. It was never going to please everyone, but I do think that a lot of these choices were good ones that make the adaptation a better film version of the material. So in this video, I'm going to be looking at some of the biggest differences between the Odyssey movie and the book, giving you guys a greater understanding of why Nolan made the changes that he did. Before I get into it though, if you want to keep up to date on any of my future content for Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey, then don't forget to support this upload by giving it a like rating, subscribing to the channel, and turning on your notifications. But without further ado, let's dive straight into some of the biggest differences between the Odyssey movie and book. So starting with one of the biggest shifts in the Odyssey movie, it's clear that Christopher Nolan has reshaped the character of Odysseus for a modern retelling. We already know him as a brilliant tactician and a fearsome warrior, but Nolan leans into something heavier in his film, the idea of a worn-down veteran carrying guilt, trauma, and the weight of his own genius. Yes, he's still the mastermind behind the Trojan horse, but in Nolan's version, that victory haunts Odysseus because of its lasting consequences. He can't escape the reality that his clever idea led to innocent people dying, homes burning, or the collapse of an entire civilization. This change essentially turns the story of Homecoming into something that's more complicated. The Trojan horse may be ingenious, but it's also a direct violation of Zeus's law, a supposed gift of peace that's secretly packed with soldiers. Nolan uses that contradiction to explore the moral cost of deception even when it wins a war. And when you remember that the world in this myth plunges into 4 centuries of darkness after these events, the thematic weight of it becomes even stronger. Nolan isn't just retelling a legend, he's drawing the lines between myth, morality, and the long shadow of human ingenuity. It's a fresh angle on Odysseus, framing him not just as the hero who comes home, but the man who has to live with what it took to get there. Homer's Odysseus was emotional and flawed, as he cried in moments and carried his own burdens, but Nolan aims to push that idea a bit further. He reframes Odysseus' most famous achievement through a modern lens, showing a man who can't escape the consequences of the brilliance that made him a legend. Now, I know this is going to anger some people, but I do think that a change like this kind of reflects the overall approach of Nolan's film, and it also relates to why other decisions were made, like the approaches to modern language. This story is nearly 3,000 years old, has been adapted in many different forms, and Nolan was looking at how he could tell this story for today's audience and do so through a large-scale event film lens. Whether you like that approach or not is really up to you, but I understand why the director made those changes so that it could better reflect the dramatic and cinematic sensibilities of a modern large-scale event film. He didn't necessarily change Odysseus, but added to his character so that in modern film form, he's someone who the audience can connect to more and understand with more humanity. And again, the modern language is another example of that, in Nolan's attempt to bring this film to everyone in a global sense, so that many who haven't read Homer or know the story can get into it through a large-scale retelling. Moving on, it's known that Nolan keeps most of Odysseus' island encounters in his film. But there are a few major pieces of the original structure missing, and these omissions change the rhythm of the story in a big way. The biggest absence is the Phaeacians from the island of Scheria. In Homer's version, Odysseus doesn't wash up on Ithaca after leaving Calypso. He first lands on the shores of the Phaeacians, exhausted and alone after drifting on a raft. This moment actually happens early in the poem's timeline. Odysseus meets Nausicaa, the Phaeacian princess, who brings him to her parents' palace. They welcome him, feast him, and treat him with the kind of hospitality that stands in sharp contrast to everything he's endured. And when a court poet sings a romanticized version of the fall of Troy, Odysseus breaks down in tears. He finally reveals who he is, and from there, he recounts all of his misadventures at sea. In Homer, this is how we learn about the giants, the enchanted islands, and even the sacred cattle of the sun god. So in removing them, Nolan had to restructure how the story unfolds. It's pretty clear why Nolan chose to cut the Phaeacian episode, as it would have added yet another major stop to an already packed journey. So instead of telling his story at a banquet, Odysseus is forced to relive those memories with Calypso as he detoxes from the lotus flower. It's more psychologically intimate, it allows more time with the journey narrative, and it keeps the film moving. Now, I won't lie, I was a little disappointed that this wasn't in the film, as the scenes in Skyria are some of the most enjoyable parts of the poem. But structurally, I do think it makes sense in why Nolan trimmed it. Including the Phaeacians would have slowed the pacing down and added yet another narrative detour to a story already filled with detours. Nolan also expands on the idea of Zeus's law in his film, turning it into one of the moral anchors. Characters mention it throughout the story as the sacred rule of hospitality, the belief that every person has a duty to welcome guests with respect, and that guests must honour their hosts in return. It's essentially the golden rule in treating others as you would wish to be treated. But in their world, it carries a divine edge, and that's because anyone you meet could be a god in disguise. By foregrounding this idea, Nolan ties the film's violence, its betrayals, and its moments of kindness back to a single moral principle. And that is that hospitality isn't just etiquette, it's the glue that holds civilization together. So when people break it, the consequences ripple across the entire story. Nolan's film also digs into the real ancient concept behind Zeus's law, as in actual Greek culture, there wasn't a literal law of Zeus written anywhere. But there was the idea of Xenia, the sacred code of hospitality tied to Zeus, the aspect of him who protects travellers and oversees host-guest relationships. Because travel was dangerous, this wasn't just in reference to politeness, as it was also a survival rule. So Nolan stretches its meaning a bit for his adaptation, but the core idea remains the same. And in particular, Nolan uses this theme to highlight the deep irony of the Trojan horse. It's celebrated as a brilliant tactic, but it's also a complete betrayal of Xenia, as the Greeks presented a harmless gift and then proceed to slaughter their hosts. In Nolan's version, that violation becomes the emotional core of Odysseus's guilt, and once he realizes what they did, the weight of it follows him across every island, every detour, and every moment of his long journey home. It's that guilt that is exactly why Nolan reshapes Odysseus into a man haunted by his own ingenuity, culminating in the raw confession he makes in the film's final scene. Moving on, another element that we hear about throughout Nolan's film, which is somewhat different, is the focus on the Sea People. When it comes to the repeated mention of the Sea People, we do hear about them throughout this adaptation, and it's known that the arrival of these people will apparently bring an end to the Bronze Age. For years, scholars have argued over whether the Odyssey might function as a kind of narrative cipher that is capable of revealing the identities of the real historical tribes, or perhaps a single powerful confederation whose movements helped trigger the Bronze Age collapse. We do know that the Bronze Age civilizations of the Egyptians, the Mycenaeans, and the Hittites did collapse, and some of them did indeed mention the Sea People. The civilizations that followed can be seen as the barbarians who then replaced them. Nolan takes that long-running debate and threads it directly into the film's own meditation on opposing war, letting the question and its resolution echo through the story's deeper moral currents. And the twist put on this idea is that, as we learn at the very end of the film, Odysseus believes that the destruction of the Bronze Age actually took place during that fateful night at Troy, and that they could be the Sea People. In his mind, he and his men could be the mentioned Sea People who were foretold to bring ruin to civilization because of that fateful night. Now, like a lot of things in the film, there is the chance that there are two sides to this question. As a counterbalance to Odysseus's feelings at the end, there are a few things that happen that could suggest they aren't the rumoured people from the sea. After Troy, Odysseus and his crew arrive at an abandoned village, and shortly after that, they meet the Laestrygonian giants who destroy 2 of their 3 ships. Within the year, the rest of the men in Odysseus's fleet perish. They didn't encounter enough communities to create the rumour of them being people from the sea. At the same time though, you could argue that the very event of Troy itself is the point of the Greeks being labelled them. That night brought about the end of a civilization, and I think this is exactly what Nolan was aiming to get at with the Sea People. Nolan is using them as a mirror held up to Odysseus, to Greece, and to the fragile idea of order itself. I think that the sea people represent the world breaking down, and they are what Odysseus could become if he lost himself completely. They are the human cost of a world where kingdoms burn, gods withdraw, and the old rules no longer hold. They have no homeland, no king, no law, and they are people without names. They are those of conflict, showing what happens to ordinary people when heroes chase glory. So Nolan uses and heightens this narrative concept to underline that civilization is not guaranteed and that it must be protected, rebuilt, and sometimes reinvented. The sea people are the shadow of Odysseus' journey, and they are what happens when the world loses its stories, its laws, and its gods. Furthermore, perhaps the biggest visceral change is how Nolan interprets ancient mythology for a modern audience, or in particular, the gods. Nolan signals his approach right from the opening line, as on screen it reads, "in a time of apparent magic." The film leaves just enough ambiguity to suggest that many of the supernatural events might have another explanation. We only see the Cyclops encounter and the other wonders with Odysseus as he tries to piece his mind back together with Calypso, which means he could be an unreliable narrator. And then by the very end, we learn that his version of Athena is actually a manifestation of his guilt, a projection of a young Trojan woman played by Zendaya. She's the same woman he saw murdered by his own countrymen on the night that Troy fell, right as the statue of Athena was beheaded. There's also room for another interpretation in all of this, and that is that Athena could be using that woman's appearance as a vessel. In Homer, she constantly disguises herself to appear to characters, so it's not impossible that she might take on the face of someone Odysseus can't forget. But the central point remains the same. Nolan uses this vision of Athena to confront Odysseus with the guilt he's been carrying, tying the supernatural elements directly to his emotional wounds. Another moment where Nolan plays with this ambiguity comes from the way Zeus's justice is portrayed. In both the film and Homer's poem, whenever justice is threatened, a rumble of thunder is heard in the sky, a sign that Zeus has made a decision on what's about to happen. It's the same sudden thunder that makes Calypso realise she has to stop feeding Odysseus the lotus flower, suggesting she may only release him because she believes that Zeus has commanded it. But again, Nolan leaves room for interpretation. You can just as easily frame it as Calypso seeing a sign and letting it guide her decision, the way people often interpret meaning in natural events. It's essentially a more grounded take on how individuals perceive the gods, not literal divine intervention, but human beings reading the world around them and acting on what they believe it means. Whether you like that change or not is entirely personal. But for me, it's an intriguing approach that keeps the mythic atmosphere while giving the characters more psychological depth. On the flip side to all of this, in Homer's The Odyssey, the gods are unmistakably real and constantly involved in the story. Odysseus survives the slaughter of the suitors with a bit of motivation and protection from Athena. Meanwhile, Poseidon rages across the seas, determined to punish Odysseus, and then Zeus drifts between apathy and sudden intervention. So the divine world is visible, loud, and ever-present in the book, a constant reminder of their existence. Coming now to the final act of Nolan's movie, there are a few notable differences from Homer that are here as well. In the second half of Homer's epic poem, Odysseus spends a long stretch wandering through Ithaca in disguise, embedding himself among the suitors and gathering information on who still remains loyal. Within all this, Athena transforms him into a wrinkled old beggar. In Nolan's film, he streamlines that entirely. His Odysseus doesn't hide behind age or magic, as he simply shields his face beneath the hood of his cloak, keeping the disguise grounded and realistic. Another major change then comes in the ambush on Telemachus. In Homer's poem, the suitors led by Antinous plot to kill Telemachus as he returns home, but Athena warns him, allowing him to avoid the strait and slip past to the assassination attempt. Nolan reimagines this as Telemachus and his advisor Mentor are ambushed at the Temple of Apollo. Mentor is killed in this scene, and Telemachus barely escapes thanks to Odysseus, who tears through the attackers while still dressed as the beggar. And Antinous also stays back in Ithaca. Next, Nolan also reshapes the final slaughter of the suitors. In his film, Odysseus takes them on almost entirely alone, cutting them down one after another and suffering near-fatal wounds in the process. Telemachus' only major contribution is killing Melanthius, stopping him from supplying more weapons to the suitors. The slave women are spared, and a few suitors even stop fighting after witnessing Odysseus' bravery, kneeling to acknowledge their king. Homer's version is far harsher, as Telemachus fights beside his father, and with Athena's help they kill every last suitor. Afterwards, Telemachus and Odysseus force the slave women who slept with the suitors to clean the hall before they're hanged. And Melanthius' death is also the most gruesome of all the suitors. So Nolan keeps the broad outline of this scene, but he does shift the emotional weight, giving the scene a more restrained and character-focused tone. And that comes in most of the closing moments of the film, when most of the differences lie. Nolan's film closes on a far gentler note than Homer's, with Penelope immediately embracing a severely wounded Odysseus, Telemachus being crowned king, and the two lovers sailing away into exile, forced to leave Ithaca after Odysseus sends so many suitors to Hades. Homer's version has a lot going on, and often scholars and historians have wondered whether this ending was actually Homeric at all. The part that they did like, which Nolan has removed in his film, is the moment where Penelope tests Odysseus by asking him to move their bed. He reveals that the bed is carved from a living olive tree and cannot be moved. And only with this reveal does Penelope realise that he is Odysseus. But the parts that many didn't like when it comes to the final book of Homer's epic poem is the moments that detail the families of the slain suitors gathering, swearing revenge, and clashing with Odysseus, Telemachus, and his father Laertes. The fighting only stops when Athena intervenes and forces peace. Nolan essentially keeps the emotional core of this, but trims all the chaos, choosing a quieter, more cinematic farewell instead of the final burst of divine-driven conflict. He does also cut out the moment where the suitors are led into Hades, although Odysseus does tell Antinous in the film when he's dying that he should go to Hades with his shame. But the biggest omission in Nolan's adaptation of the ending is the complete removal of Laertes. In Homer's poem, Laertes is central to the emotional core of the ending. He's the once great warrior for whom Penelope is secretly unweaving a burial shroud for each night. Broken by grief over Odysseus' 20-year absence, he abandons the palace and retreats to his farm, living in isolation. Odysseus' reunion with Laertes is a moving moment at the end of the book, but it's also where Odysseus cruelly tests his father by pretending to be a stranger. And once Athena restores Laertes' strength, he joins Odysseus and Telemachus in the final clash against the vengeful families of the slain suitors, even killing Antinous' father himself. Because of all the different things that happen in the final episode of Homer's book, and then the mixed viewpoints towards it over many years, I can kind of understand why Nolan changed this and tried to focus primarily on the grief of Odysseus. We now come to some of the changes to the more mythical sequences and creatures. Nolan removes Odysseus' crew's early encounter with the Lotus Eaters, as in Homer, this happens near the start of their travels. In the poem, Odysseus doesn't eat the plant, but he scolds his crew for losing themselves and forgetting home. That same pattern repeats with Aeolus, the wind god who gives Odysseus a bag containing powerful winds that would carry them straight to Ithaca, defying the will of the gods. But just as Ithaca comes into sight, the crew opens the bag thinking it's treasure, and the unleashed winds blow them wildly off course. Nolan keeps the consequences of this, but trims the early detour, tightening the structure while preserving the core idea that Odysseus' men repeatedly sabotage their own homecoming. It's also important to note that Nolan combines the Lotus plant within the scenes that Odysseus shares with Calypso. When it comes to the Laestrygonian giants that Odysseus and his crew clash with, there are also a few differences. In Homer, they're towering giants, described as huge as a mountain, who devour Odysseus' men and destroy 11 of his 12 ships by hurling massive boulders at them. It's one of the most catastrophic losses in the entire poem. In the film though, the Laestrygonians are reimagined as smaller but still imposing knight-like figures who manipulate the forest to trap Odysseus' crew, and they end up destroying 2 of the 3 ships instead. So the danger of this scene remains, but Nolan scales the encounter down to fit the film's more grounded tone. And when it then comes to Nolan's take on both the Sirens and Circe scenes, these are also reworked a bit to fit his psychological, grounded approach to all the myth. The Sirens are no longer supernatural temptresses offering knowledge, and instead their encounter exposes that a part of Odysseus doesn't actually want to return home. And rather than Circe being the seductive goddess who hosts Odysseus for an entire year, she becomes a more human, earthy sorceress whose magic reveals the greed and brutality of his men when she turns them into pigs. These small changes aim to highlight more of the emotional and moral consequences of Odysseus' journey, aligning the film with Nolan's recurring themes of guilt, trauma, and the cost of heroism. Perhaps the biggest of changes to the mythological sequences, though, comes in the differences of the Cyclops scene. In the film, Odysseus and his men escape the Cyclops by blinding him and strapping straw to their backs so the blinded monster can't tell them apart from the sheep. In Homer's poem, the men cling to the undersides of the sheep and are carried out that way instead. On top of this, the blinding of the Cyclops has also been changed. In the poem, Odysseus gets the Cyclops drunk before attacking him, whereas in the film, the strike happens while the Cyclops is asleep. The biggest difference of the scene, though, comes in the removal of the famous name trick, where in the poem, the Cyclops asks Odysseus his name, and he answers nobody. So when Polyphemus is blinded and screams that nobody is hurting him, the other Cyclopses ignore him. Odysseus ruins the deception by shouting his real name as he escapes, allowing Polyphemus, a son of Poseidon, to call on his father and curse the crew. Nolan removes the wine and the nobody trick in his film, though the men still earn Poseidon's wrath when Odysseus shoots the Cyclops with an arrow outside the cave. Furthermore, the next difference surrounds the character of Achilles and why he was not in the Hades scene. In Homer's Odyssey, Achilles appears during Odysseus' descent into the underworld, and their exchange is one of the poem's most striking reversals of heroic values. Odysseus approaches Achilles expecting to find the great warrior proud of his eternal fame, but Achilles tells him that he would rather be a living servant than a dead hero. That moment is Homer's way of dismantling the heroic code from within, in that the greatest champion of the Trojan War admits that glory is meaningless in death. It's a scene that reframes the entire epic, showing that Odysseus' journey is not about reclaiming honour, but about reclaiming life, home, and identity. Nolan understood this, and his decision to remove Achilles from the underworld sequence is a deliberate thematic choice that transforms the meaning of Odysseus' descent. In Nolan's The Odyssey, Achilles' absence becomes a powerful statement about the collapse of the heroic age. So by omitting the greatest warrior of the Trojan War, Nolan is signalling that the values Achilles had embodied have no place in the world Odysseus is trying to return to. The underworld in the film is a graveyard of consequences, a place where Odysseus confronts the human cost of the war he helped wage. So instead of meeting Achilles there in the film, Odysseus encounters Agamemnon, whose story is far more relevant to the film's emotional focus. Agamemnon embodies the dangers awaiting Odysseus at home, in a kingdom in disarray, a marriage poisoned by absence, and a household destroyed by betrayal. So Agamemnon keeps it grounded in the fragility of domestic life, the very thing Odysseus fears losing. In Nolan's film, we also get Elliot Page's Sinon in the Hades scene, and that character is not in Homer's The Odyssey. Sinon is a figure from Greek mythology who first appears in Book 2 of the Virgil Aeneid, an epic poem written by the Roman poet Virgil. And it's known in that poem that Sinon is the Greek soldier who helps carry out Odysseus' Trojan horse plan. So Nolan uses Sinon in Hades to force Odysseus to confront the darker side of his identity. Yes, the Trojan horse is Odysseus' most famous act, but it's also the act that killed thousands, ended a civilization, and set the stage for a suffering that fills the rest of the film. Sinon is the human face of that act, in the one who delivered the lie, who persuaded the Trojans, and who made Odysseus' plan possible. So seeing Sinon in the underworld means that Odysseus must face the human wreckage of his own cunning. Achilles would have told him that glory is meaningless, but Sinon silently shows him that glory is destructive. And that helps leave a bigger impact come the end of the film. The last difference I wanted to discuss was how Nolan approaches the travels of Telemachus, and then also the changes to Clytemnestra, Helen of Troy, and the sacrifice of Iphigenia. Starting with Telemachus, Nolan condenses his travels dramatically. In the film, he only visits Sparta, where he meets Menelaus and Helen of Troy. But in Homer's poem, his journey is longer, as he first travels to Pylos to meet King Nestor, one of the wisest surviving leaders of the Trojan War, before continuing on to Sparta. Nestor gives him context, history, and guidance, acting almost like a mentor figure. My guess is that Nolan trimmed this for the same reason he cut the Phaeacians, having too many characters, locations, and too many narrative detours for a film already overflowing with stops, islands, and mythic encounters. Including Nestor would mean introducing yet another major character with his own backstory, his own war memories, and his own thematic way. For a novel, this is perfect, but for a movie, it becomes more difficult, especially one trying to balance so many other things. Personally, I was fine with this decision, and I think it allows his stop with Menelaus and Helen to be richer in revealing some of the things we learn there. And coming to what we learn, it's time to discuss how Nolan portrays some of the Iliad elements included, like with Helen, Clytemnestra, and Agamemnon. Nolan's film reshapes the entire Atreid backstory, giving Clytemnestra, Helen, and the sacrifice of Iphigenia a darker, more psychologically grounded tone than Homer's poem. In Homer, Clytemnestra's murder of Agamemnon is treated as a grim act of vengeance, while Nolan leans into the emotional devastation behind it, portraying her not just as a betrayer, but as a woman shattered by her daughter's death and the lies that led to it. Helen of Troy too is reframed as, instead of the distant, idealized beauty whose abduction sparks the war, Nolan shows how over time she was affected by the whole ordeal and her face being scarred for its launching of 1,000 ships. Both are minor characters in Homer's poem, and while Helen and Clytemnestra are twin sisters in the film, they are half-sisters in the book. The biggest shift within all of this though comes with the sacrifice of Iphigenia. Homer references the event only indirectly, but Nolan foregrounds the deception, showing glimpses of Agamemnon luring his daughter to Aulis under the false promise of marriage to Achilles, emphasizing Odysseus' role in helping orchestrate the lie. The film treats the sacrifice as a moral rupture that poisons everything that follows. It destroys Agamemnon's marriage, fuels Clytemnestra's rage, and becomes a thematic mirror for Odysseus' own guilt-ridden journey home. In Nolan's version, this entire episode isn't just a backstory, it's the emotional fault line that reshapes how we understand every character touched by the Trojan War. But that was my video discussing some of the main differences between Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey and the epic poem by Homer. What do you think of the changes that Nolan made with his adaptation, and what are some of the other differences that you picked out? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments section, alongside your overall reaction to the film. For much more videos and breakdowns, then subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications. Also, if you enjoyed this video, remember to leave a like, rating, and follow me on social media via the links in the description. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I've been Cortex, and as always, make some noise.